This is my ranking of side-scrolling games that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is ranked from masterpiece to trash based on how smooth the movement feels, how fun the combat or platforming is, and how well each game maintains engaging pacing and level design. Let's get straight into the list. Blasphemous 2 instantly stood out because every area looked disturbing in a way that kept me curious to see what nightmare would appear next. I spent most of the game switching between weapons during platforming sections, solving movement puzzles, and fighting strange enemies that looked like they came straight out of a cursed painting. The combat felt faster and smoother than the first game, especially when chaining attacks together while moving through traps and hidden paths. Some bosses were easier than I expected, but their designs still stayed memorable because of how bizarre and brutal they looked during fights. The dark religious setting, creepy soundtrack, and detailed pixel art gave the whole adventure a heavy atmosphere that stayed consistent from beginning to end. This easily earns a masterpiece tier placement. Vengeful Guardian Moonrider immediately gave me strong retro action game vibes with its fast sword combat, pixel art style, and side-scrolling stages filled with enemies attacking from every direction. I liked how quickly I could move through levels by dashing, wall jumping, and slicing through groups of enemies without slowing down too much. The controls felt smooth and responsive, which made the platforming sections easier to handle even during chaotic fights. I also enjoyed experimenting with different special weapons after beating bosses, although most of them felt useful mainly for dealing extra damage instead of changing how I approached combat. The game never became extremely difficult, but the pacing stayed fun because stages moved quickly and rarely wasted time with unnecessary mechanics or long sections. I'd place this in the great tier without much hesitation. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge felt like jumping straight into a classic arcade game, but with smoother combat and faster gameplay that made every stage more fun to replay. I spent most of my time switching between characters because each turtle had different animations, attack styles, and movement that changed how fights played out. The combat stayed simple, though the dodge rolls, charged attacks, and super moves added enough variety to keep battles entertaining across the campaign. I also liked how quickly the game moved from one colorful level to another without wasting time on long cutscenes or complicated mechanics. The soundtrack added a lot of energy during fights, especially during chaotic moments filled with enemies everywhere on screen. This lands nicely into the excellent tier. Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, surprised me with how smooth and fast everything felt from the very beginning, especially during combat and platforming sections that demanded quick reactions almost constantly. I spent a lot of time chaining together dashes, parries, aerial attacks, and movement abilities while exploring areas filled with traps, hidden routes, and difficult enemy encounters. The combat stayed exciting because enemies hit hard enough to force me into learning attack patterns instead of button mashing through fights. I also liked how the map encouraged exploration without becoming frustrating, mainly because the movement abilities made backtracking feel fun instead of repetitive. Some platforming sequences became extremely intense later in the game, but the controls stayed precise enough that every mistake felt fair. This easily stands as a clear masterpiece tier. Bloodstained Ritual of the Night gave me exactly the kind of side-scrolling adventure I wanted with its huge castle, non-stop exploration, and massive amount of weapons and abilities to experiment with during combat. I spent hours unlocking new powers, revisiting older areas, and finding hidden paths that slowly opened more of the map as my movement options expanded. The combat stayed fun because there were so many different weapons and demon abilities that constantly changed how encounters played out against enemies and bosses. I also liked how the castle kept introducing strange locations and weird monsters that made exploration feel rewarding even late into the game. Some technical issues appeared occasionally, but they never ruined the experience because the progression loop remained addictive from start to finish. This settles into the excellent tier. Spelunky 2 became addictive for me because every single run felt unpredictable, and even small mistakes could suddenly destroy an amazing attempt within seconds. I spent most of my time carefully watching traps, enemies, and hidden dangers while trying to move quickly enough before the ghost appeared to chase me through the level. The game constantly forced me to learn from failures instead of relying on upgrades or permanent progression, which made every successful run feel rewarding in a different way. I also liked how the branching paths, secret areas, and random item combinations kept changing the experience even after many hours of playing. Some deaths were frustrating, though many of them also became hilarious because of how chaotic the interactions between enemies, traps, and physics could get during intense moments. I'll place it in the masterpiece tier. Cuphead immediately grabbed my attention with its hand-drawn cartoon style, fast boss fights, and non-stop action that demanded quick reactions almost every second. I spent most of the game learning attack patterns, dodging projectiles, and slowly improving through repeated attempts against bosses that constantly introduced new surprises during later phases. The run-and-gun stages were also fun because they gave short breaks from the intense boss encounters while still keeping the same chaotic energy. I also liked how the music and sound effects matched the old animation style perfectly, making every fight feel lively from beginning to end. Playing in co-op made certain battles easier, though the challenge still stayed high enough to keep every victory satisfying after many failed attempts without feeling cheap either. I want to put it in the masterpiece tier. Skul the Hero Slayer stayed fun for me because every run could completely change depending on which skulls and abilities I found during the early stages. I spent most of my time swapping between different skull combinations, experimenting with builds, and figuring out which abilities worked best together during fast fights against large groups of enemies. Some skulls focused on heavy attacks while others were built around speed or magic, so combat rarely felt repetitive even after many failed runs. I also liked how smooth the controls felt during chaotic moments where quick movement and constant dodging became necessary to survive later areas. The bosses were not always the most memorable part of the experience, though the replay value stayed strong because there were so many different ways to approach each run. This earns a solid spot in the great tier of my ranking. Hollow Knight Silksong immediately felt bigger and faster with its smooth movement, difficult platforming, and intense boss fights that constantly tested my timing and patience. I spent hours exploring hidden paths, unlocking new abilities, and returning to older areas to discover secrets that I completely missed earlier in the adventure. The combat stayed exciting because enemies attacked aggressively, forcing me to learn patterns instead of rushing into fights without thinking. I also loved how every area looked different, with beautiful backgrounds, memorable music, and strange characters that made the world feel alive during exploration. Some sections became brutally difficult later on, but the controls stayed precise enough that every mistake still felt fair after repeated attempts. This easily stands tall in the masterpiece tier of my personal ranking. Ender Magnolia Bloom in the Mist kept me interested because of its relaxing atmosphere, smooth combat, and beautiful areas filled with haunting music during exploration. I spent most of the game unlocking movement abilities, experimenting with different builds, and revisiting older locations to uncover hidden paths and useful upgrades. The combat felt simple at first, though it became much more satisfying once I gained faster movement options and stronger abilities later in the adventure. I also liked how every region carried a different mood through its visuals, soundtrack, and strange enemies that slowly revealed more about the world. Some early sections felt slower than I expected, especially when backtracking through larger areas before unlocking better movement tools. This gets a strong place in the excellent tier. SteamWorld Heist 2 kept me entertained because its turn-based battles mixed strategy with manual aiming, making every shot feel more satisfying during difficult missions. I spent most of the game building different robot squads, experimenting with class combinations, and finding clever ways to complete objectives while escaping enemy reinforcements before situations became overwhelming. The combat stayed interesting because maps were designed around movement, teamwork, and positioning instead of simply defeating every enemy in sight. I also liked exploring the ocean between missions since it added variety with naval combat, hidden treasure, and smaller side activities that broke up the pacing nicely. Some progression systems felt a little grindy at times, especially when unlocking certain class abilities for multiple characters across longer play sessions. It gets a place in the great tier. Rayman Legends stayed exciting for me because almost every level introduced new ideas, different mechanics, or creative platforming sections that constantly changed the pace of the adventure. I spent most of the game running through colorful stages, avoiding traps, discovering hidden areas, and replaying levels to collect missed secrets scattered throughout each world. The movement felt smooth once I adjusted to the slightly floaty jumps, and the level design stayed fun because stages rarely repeated the same ideas for too long. I also loved the music levels since they mixed platforming with rhythm in a way that made every sequence feel memorable. The visual style carried a huge amount of personality as well, especially during boss fights filled with exaggerated animations and chaotic action everywhere on screen. This deserves the Masterpiece tier ranking. Celeste completely surprised me with how emotional and difficult the experience became while still keeping the platforming fun from beginning to end. I spent hours learning jump timings, air dashes, and wall climbing mechanics while slowly improving through constant retries during extremely challenging sections. The controls felt incredibly responsive, which made every failure feel fair, because mistakes usually came from my own timing instead of bad design. I also loved how each chapter introduced different mechanics and level ideas that kept the adventure fresh even after many hours of playing. The soundtrack added so much energy and emotion during important moments, especially during intense sequences that demanded quick reactions and perfect movement. The story also connected surprisingly well with the gameplay, making the climb feel meaningful alongside all the difficult platforming challenges throughout the journey. This gets Masterpiece tier placement. Warhammer 40,000 Shootas. Blood and Teef immediately felt chaotic with non-stop shooting, loud orc humor, and explosions covering almost every stage from beginning to end. I spent most of the campaign running through destroyed battlefields, blasting enemies apart, collecting Teef for weapon upgrades, and fighting giant bosses that always looked ridiculous in the best possible way. The gameplay stayed simple the entire time, mostly focusing on jumping, shooting, and throwing explosives, while enemies flooded the screen from different directions. I also liked how colorful and detailed the environments looked despite the grim setting, especially during larger battles filled with fire and destruction everywhere. The campaign ended much faster than I expected, and the combat never evolved enough to stay exciting for long sessions alone. This settles into the good tier. Iron Meat immediately reminded me of classic run-and-gun shooters with non-stop explosions, grotesque enemy designs, and chaotic stages filled with bullets coming from every direction. I spent most of the campaign jumping between platforms, swapping weapons, and blasting through strange monsters while trying to survive overwhelming attacks during fast-moving levels. The pixel art looked fantastic throughout the adventure, especially during boss fights where giant flesh-covered machines completely filled the screen with chaos and destruction. I also liked the heavy soundtrack because it matched the aggressive pacing and constant action happening during battles. The gameplay stayed simple and responsive, though the short campaign and repetitive structure stopped the experience from becoming something I wanted to revisit often after finishing everything available. For me, it goes in the mediocre tier. Pizza Tower instantly became one of the wildest side-scrolling games I played because of its non-stop speed, bizarre humor, and chaotic platforming that rarely slowed down for even a moment. I spent most of the game sprinting through levels, smashing through walls, finding hidden rooms, and trying to maintain momentum while everything around me turned completely ridiculous. The movement system felt amazing once I understood how to chain dashes, dives, grabs, and wall running together without losing speed during difficult sections. I also loved how every stage introduced strange mechanics or transformations that constantly changed how levels played from start to finish. The soundtrack added so much energy during escape sequences, especially when racing back through collapsing levels before the timer expired completely. This absolutely deserves its place in my Masterpiece tier. That's my ranking of side-scrolling games based on best movement, combat, platforming, and level design throughout the entire adventure. Thanks for watching!